My son, David, sent me a text message early this morning. He went to a baseball game last night in San Diego and told me about it, and he even sent me video of the fireworks that took place afterwards, and it was quite spectacular. And then he said, I don't remember what prompted it, I sent something back, and he started, well, ha-ha on the text message, but he wrote after that when we went out of the ballpark last night, him and his friends, we left the ballpark last night, and there was a man playing Take Me Out to the Ball Game on some bagpipes outside a place called the Twisted Kilt. And I said, of all places, San Diego, California. That's something that appeals to David because ever since he's been very, very young, he has had deep affection for his family's Scottish roots. He has other roots too, but he doesn't pay much attention to them. But he has very deep appreciation of the fact that we are part Scottish. He was, even at one time, quite an outstanding, what do you call it, a step dancer? What do they call those things? Irish step dancer. And the Scottish version of it, he was only about 6 years old. It was amazing how good he was. I couldn't believe it. But it has meant a lot to him to know those roots, as they should to all of us, I believe. I'm going to read to you a couple of verses from the book of Lamentations. But before I do that, let me ask you, have any of you ever seen anybody take a rolled up newspaper and whack a tree with it? Well, I have. Relate that to you in just a minute. Hear with me, if you will, the first 3 verses of chapter 3 of the book of Lamentations, and a couple of verses a little later on. By the way, I should mention the book of Lamentations is a writing that has come down to us, took place during the time when the people of Israel were carted off as hostages by the Babylonian invaders led by King Nebuchadnezzar, and held there against their will. And this was after a brutal conflict in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem, in an assertion of Babylonian power, and the pain and turmoil and chaos and anger that welled up within these people can be found, for example, in Psalm 137, if you ever want to look that up. And you get a taste of it right here too. As I read this, hear this message, probably from the prophet Jeremiah, but we're not sure about that. I am one who has seen affliction under the rod of God's wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Against me alone he turns his hand, again and again, all day long. And he's interpreting a lot of the events that he narrates thereafter as God acting against him. I don't share that thought, but I want to share with you, though, the reaction at the end of this particular chapter at verse 19. The thought of my affliction and my homelessness is wormwood and gall. Think fire and brimstone, something very bitter when you hear wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Remember that. Therefore I have hope. Then he goes into a doxology. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. At the end of that doxology, he adds, the Lord is my portion, says my soul, and therefore I will have hope in him. I have heard the question, I don't know how many times, how in the world did you end up in ministry? There are times even when the tone sounds like it's an allegation of sorts, also almost like being asked, how did you end up on last night's episode of Cops? If I were to answer honestly, and I generally try to, I don't know that you can point to just one decision or series of decisions that I made as an adult. I think the roots of that go a lot deeper. But the roots that I'm talking about are not just about time. They're roots that can be planted even late in life. Let me explain what I mean by that. I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of kids around. And I think, fortunately for me, I grew up before video games and other distractions were all around. We used to make phone calls and get together and play baseball and so forth, and other sports as well. We'd go to an open field or to a ballpark and just play for a good while. I've noticed over the last, I don't know how many years, 20 years, let's say, kids don't even do that anymore. My son did, he played. It's more than just technology. You see, kids don't seem to even believe that they can do anything like that unless an adult supervises them. It's the curse of Little League. It's a different world. It's a world that adults have made in our efforts to indulge and indeed be very protective. We don't allow kids to grow as they once did. It is indeed a different world than I grew up in. Perhaps you recall the early couple of pages, it might be the first page or the second page certainly, of To Kill a Mockingbird, and very early in the movie as well. Scout, the narrator, says, "The days were 24 hours long then, but they seemed longer." And she was talking about her small town in Alabama and how things didn't change much, and that was her way of expressing it. I didn't have that experience. To me, things seemed to change a great deal faster back then and continue to do so. I vividly remember, for example, there were three, I say main roads, three very busy roads in the town that I grew up in. And one of them simply called the Boulevard, which was the main drag through town, which had lots of businesses for about 4 or 5 miles, however long it stretches. And I remember riding my bike on one of the other main roads that intersected with it. And we would come up over a railroad bridge. And off to our right would be something that we would today call a convenience store, which is no longer there. And on our left, there was just an open field. Nothing there. And then, within a short time after that, I can remember the building of a W.T. Grant's department store, right in that open area. And then some other shops sprang up around it. A service station moved in. And later on, that Grant's department store closed and another business moved in. And then there was a U-Crops which came in. And that whole area today, even with the U-Crops that's been there for many years, looks very, very old to me. Now, there was another road called Conduit Road. There wasn't a whole lot of imagination in my hometown when it came to dreaming up road names, was there? Boulevard and Conduit. But it paralleled, in fact, right at the point I'm talking about, it crossed over I-95. And right there, right off of the interstate, the only exit in Colonial Heights where I grew up, right there was just a machine, a small engine machine shop or repair shop. And there was a field around that. And then behind that field, nothing but trees as far as you could see. Now, that field and those trees, gone. In fact, now, it's one of the biggest malls on the entire East Coast. And that mall looks tired now, too. I can remember when we attended the church that was on the street right behind, diagonally across behind my house. And the church then, at that time, was just a split-level house, nothing more. It wasn't long before I went into the new sanctuary that was being built across the road from it. And I can remember walking around and smelling the boards that had been freshly cut. And that smell of the lumber still sticks. I can remember the tile floors, and remember the folded up chairs that we used to use for pews. I can remember my first foray into a pew Bible. And I opened it up, and it had something called, what we call now, or I call now, the Book of Job. But I remember looking at it and thinking, isn't it nice that working people have their own book in the Bible? But the God that I heard about in that church was nothing but wormwood and gall, fire and brimstone. The God in that church sounded nothing like the light that lights up the whole world. He sounded nothing like a God who had any inclination to try and save it. So instead of nurturing the roots that I was growing then, it became a place that could have very easily cut them off completely. But I got a different lesson from the town doctor that I went to and many others went to. He was the one that would take fully grown trees on his property and he had a rolled up newspaper and he would whack them. And he was asked why and he said, "I like to get their attention. I want to toughen them up." Dr. Stanley Boyce. Dr. Boyce taught me many things, such as, if you have an upset stomach, drink a Coke. He repaired my ankle when I caught it in the spokes of the bike that my dad was riding and I was on as a passenger. And I remember being in his office and my dad feeling guilty, and while Dr. Boyce was smirking, my dad would run next door to the drugstore, which was convenient. The doctor's office and the drugstore in the same building. Running next door and buying a matchbox, a small metal car that many of us treasured. And each one he brought just made me cry even louder. It wasn't the one I wanted, and Dr. Boyce just continuing to smile. And among other things, I would say that Dr. Boyce he had some interesting habits. I wouldn't call him strange, but interesting. He had a very interesting theory regarding planting of new trees, by the way. He liked to plant them, but his method of dealing with them was a little unconventional. He would never water them. Never. And I'm sure that flew in the face of a whole lot of horticultural teaching at the time. But he decided that if you watered a tree, it wouldn't grow tough enough. You had to force trees to reach deep down, to grow deep roots. If you didn't, every tree that came along after it would grow weaker and weaker. Over time, all the trees would be spoiled. It wouldn't be anything worth seeing. You had to be tough on those trees. He was generations ahead of many people. You had to weed out what I call the sissy trees. My words, not his. He despised those sissy trees. But deep roots, they were cherished. Years ago, in that very same town, 12, 13 or so years ago, I guess, my widowed mother-in-law remarried, and I performed the ceremony. And we were going to hold it in a gazebo, which was right on the banks of the Appomattox River. But the wedding was going to take place 2 days after a major hurricane, I don't remember which one it was that far back, but whichever one it was, tore up everything. The river left its calling card. Normally the gazebo was maybe 80, 90 feet from the shore. At this point, when we were doing the ceremony, it was about 30 feet away. There was debris everywhere, but mostly I remember huge trees knocked over completely, their roots exposed, but the roots didn't look all that long and didn't reach, obviously, very deep. They didn't own the house when those trees were planted, but those roots, whoever did plant them or if they grew up wild on their own, they were certainly not enough to withstand that storm. Dr. Boyce passed away decades ago, but the trees that he planted, still tall, still strong, with deep, deep roots. Later on, I lived in Greene County, north of Charlottesville, within sight of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And in fact, I used to ride my bike over and ride up those hills. And right along Route 29. And I can remember trying to grow grass there. And I watered it, and I fertilized it, and I did all the things you're not supposed to do. I babied it, I coddled it. Then the heat came. And I blamed the thin soil for its demise, the grass's demise. But looking back, I wonder if it was just the shallow roots. The roots of grass that had been babied. After all, it was adversity and deprivation that made those trees grow strong and tall. And in that very same house, my first 2 children were born. You know, I can remember sneaking into their rooms after they'd gone to sleep and praying over them. And I usually prayed that their lives would be easy. I prayed there would be no real adversity, that things would go smoothly for them. Some might claim that those prayers went unanswered. I just think that my aim was probably off. And it was off because as we look back, we realize that nobody, first of all, goes through life undefeated. I know they're going to experience hardship. They already have. Probably more than their share for their age. But praying they would never face chronic illness, or praying that they would never face someone dying young, a relative, or praying that their parents would be more attentive and not dismiss what we might have thought were their lesser concerns, well, that was probably naive. It would have been better, would have been best, to pray for the resiliency and the courage and the strength to withstand all the storms that life brings with it. But parents, they're usually young ones too. And they like to indulge their fantasies. In another place earlier in the book, the author of Lamentations writes of false and deceptive visions. Those visions are the privilege of all of us, at least when we're young. But there comes a day when we all have to look to our roots, the deep roots that we hopefully have planted. His people, the writer of Lamentations, his people faced adversity like none of us have ever seen. His people were slaughtered. They were taken hostage. They were forced to live in a strange land. Their roots had to be deep. Life had certainly not coddled them. And yet, right in the middle of the story, the tone changes. We lapse into doxology, praise. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. How does that happen? Well, because their roots ran pretty deep. They ran deep into the soil of their land. They ran deep into their collective past. Let me ask you, as you hear this story, do you think they're indulging some kind of a pious frolic? Or are they experiencing and expressing here some heartfelt, honest grief? And yet they are still able to offer us an extraordinary statement of faith. And even if you didn't start young yourself, maybe you didn't go to Sunday school, maybe you never went to vacation Bible school, all the traditions that we associate with coming to know the faith ourselves as children, things can still change for you too. And I can say that without any fear of contradiction whatsoever. Because you remember that church that I told you could have killed off my faith roots? It did. It did. I never went to vacation Bible school if I could avoid it. I only went a couple of times at most. I didn't go to Sunday school when I was a kid. I couldn't wait to get out of that glistening, pretty sanctuary. Because that God was wormwood and gall to me. They went on to build 2 more sanctuaries. The whole complex takes up a whole city block with its gym and its buses lined up outside and its huge American flags and its marquee and its running message across the bottom and every other definition of Baal worship that you can imagine. But you see, faith roots are not about time, at least not necessarily. They're about life. Life in all of its awkward and ugly and glorious and fruitful forms. Not time. You know, just like Dr. Boyce, God looks generations ahead too. Remember, Dr. Boyce even let the young trees experience the trials of life, at least as a tree, to make them stronger. In other words, with a purpose. Because I want you to remember this too. I didn't read it earlier, but in the book of Isaiah, the Lord also speaks of creating something he calls rivers in the desert. 43rd chapter. And it's in other places as well. He would create, in other words, new things where nothing had been before. Whatever needs nourishing can come from those rivers. The rivers of God. Just like he did for me. He can create a river in your desert